My parents-in-law found themselves wrapped up in one of the largest Ponzi schemes in New Zealand at the time. So there was 81 victims and about 15.7 million New Zealand dollars, which is about 8 million pounds, stolen. But the really interesting thing about this case is this Ponzi scheme had been going for 40 years.
Hello, cruel world. We have a very special guest on today, Sarah Ferris. Hello to you, Sarah.
Hello, how are you?
Very well, thank you. So Sarah and I are buddies from CrimeCon, where we both attended last September, was it?
Yeah, well, it feels like ages ago now.
And Sarah gave me all these tips and bits of advice of how to grow, and then I forgot and ignored all of it until she just reminded me of this conversation.
Oh, well.
So today we're going to talk about a specific case, which I know very little about, but Sarah knows loads about. So she's going to talk us through what happened. And then Sarah's going to ask me some questions specifically about the psychology behind it, or it's related to fraud.
Yes, absolutely.
So go ahead, tell us what you know.
Okay, so, well, interestingly enough, I've just finished listening to your chapter on the con artist, which we're going to go back to later in your fabulous book. And I think having listened to your perspective in your book before doing this interview, it actually gave me a bit of insight of what I can ask you, what I can't. So, you guide me if there's things that don't make sense for you as a psychiatrist, not a psychologist. So this case, as you know, and the listeners probably don't, the reason we met was because I produced a podcast called Conning the Con, which was about when my sister found herself dating a serial con man that she met on Tinder. That was in 2019. 2019 was kind of like, when you wait for a bus for ages and then two come along at once. So a month after my sister had found out that she'd been conned, my parents-in-law found themselves wrapped up in one of the largest Ponzi schemes in New Zealand at the time. So there was 81 victims and about 15.7 million New Zealand dollars, which is about 8 million pounds, stolen. But the really interesting thing about this case is this Ponzi scheme had been going for 40 years. Wow. So, yeah, so my parents-in-law were actually one of the earliest victims, and they met him way back in the 70s. So the guy's name is Barry Kloogh, and he is an authorized financial advisor, or was. And what he was initially doing was selling, three products, basically. He was doing debt reduction schemes, insurance, and investment advice. So oftentimes to get the people on board, I like to think of it as grooming. He would have free seminars. And at the beginning, they were basic seminars. You might get like a cup of tea and a stale digestive or something. But then over the years, as the scheme grew and he got a little bit more flashy, one would say, he would then add in free dinners. And at those seminars, he was very much just giving away financial tips. And you could then book in for another hour-long free session afterwards. And that's pretty much that was his sales funnel. And that is pretty much how all of those 81 victims, I think, came into Barry's, what would you call it? Sites.
Web and seat.
Yeah, exactly. One of the victims actually uses the word falling in, like a Venus flytrap. That reminded me of, actually. So once he's got that kind of relationship, a lot of the time he didn't actually go and take any money off these people for years. And I mean years. Sometimes they were just doing the debt reduction plan. So in the case of my parents-in-law, I don't think they didn't have any money to invest. These were not high-flying people. These were working class people that were saving just for their retirements, and some of them were trying to pay off debt for their mortgages and that kind of thing. Young families when they met them first, which is what was the case with my parents-in-law. So he would sell them insurance policies that would then be able to be cashed out when they got to their maybe 50s, for example, and that would be their retirement pot. Now, if you could think about that, he sold those insurance policies sometimes 15 years beforehand, before they mature.
Yeah.
Then when they do mature, he's there to sweep it up, get them to cash out the insurance policies, and then invest them with him. But
let me just interrupt you. So just so I've got this correct. So are you saying that the debt reduction plans and the insurance policies themselves were legit? So they were real, but it's afterwards he's got your confidence, and afterwards with the money that you make from that, he was fraudulent with that. Is that right?
Exactly. And there's so many iterations of how he did it as well. So for example, my mother-in-law had a legitimate policy that she managed to have with him for, I think it was 15 years, cashed it out and got the money, but she didn't invest it with him. So that was fine. So she's kind of got that layer of trust. But on top of that, he's very much ingratiating himself into everybody's daily lives as well. So people were considering him a friend. He was a pillar of the community. He was a thespian. He'd put on like shows and invite everyone along, take them to concerts. So there's a really deep level of grooming that went on over those years. So there's two cases that were just really, you think how that take it from, often a Ponzi scheme, you think financial fraud off, Bernie Madoff, you need 400 million. It's rich people that are putting the money in. This is not the case with this Ponzi scheme. These are people working hard, putting away their money, like all of their money for their retirement. So giving up in the now, so they had something to look forward to in the future.
Yeah.
In this first case, the family, they were really hardworking. Mother's a nurse. The father's a diesel mechanic. They have a child that, dies 7 months old. Really, they've been through enough trauma. They then go on to have 3 more children. So 2 of those children are actually born with Fragile X, and one of them is very much will always be living at home with them.
Yeah.
So what they've done is they've put away the government support money that they've been given, because they're obviously supporting that child anyway. And they've put this pot of money, and the idea is that pot of money will then go and be invested so that that child will never have to go into a care home after they've gone.
Yeah.
So they put that money into Barry Klooogh's investment scheme. And that's not the first thing that they've invested with him. They've got a really long history with him, so much so that the father has actually worked on Barry's properties as doing maintenance work, taking along their disabled child with them. So Barry's got a personal relationship with that child.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I find really hard to imagine, and which is why we're going to talk about the traits that make somebody able to do that.
Yeah.
So that's the first case, that Barry wiped them out of their money. That was the end game for that one. The second case, which is horrific in another way, is the story of Karen and Chris Churchill. Now, their names she's been very public with her name, so I'm able to use her name. What happened with Karen and Chris was they never invested any money with Barry initially. So they were purely insurance clients, and Barry sold them a trauma policy and a life insurance policy back in 2015. Unfortunately, not too many years later, Chris was diagnosed with esophageal cancer.
Yeah.
When that happened, they obviously thought, what's our trauma policy? We've got these insurance policies. So they went back to Barry, and Barry said, I've got you. Don't worry. We've got these policies sorted.
Yeah.
Tell you what, here's the trauma policy, but I can, maybe what we can do is get an early payout of the life insurance policy. And, that way you'll be able to invest the money, and I can make it work better for you. And when you're gone, Chris, I will be able to look after your wife. And they were a blended family. They had 8 children together, 2 foster children and 6 children between the 2 of them. So the point of this that really is really irking to me and just unfathomable is he sat in their lounge beside a dying man, crying beside this man, knowing he was dying, and saying to him, "Don't worry, I will make sure that Karen and the kids are fine." 2 days later, Karen has lost her husband. The day after that, the Serious Fraud Office goes in and the Ponzi scheme is exposed and blown up, and she's left with zero, nothing, nothing at all. So that is probably just the tip of the iceberg. That, you know, of the victims, there's so many stories, and they're all iterations of just dreams robbed.
And I have to ask, what did Barry do? Well, what did he do with his money, and how did he get caught?
So, you know, he never, over that time, you think about like 40 years, he was audited, never got caught. He told the judge in the trial that he was using probably just a tiny percentage of the money on his lifestyle, and the rest of it was to feed the Ponzi scheme and then on a marketing thing. But very unlikely. He was, you know, leasing expensive cars, going on big world trips, cruises with his wife. I think the kids were in private education. So and just at the time that the Ponzi scheme was collapsing, he'd put in an offer on probably the most expensive house in the town. And here's another kind of weird, you know, that con man psyche of, I'm just going to fake it till I make it. He didn't actually have any funds in the bank at that time to pay the deposit for that house. So he would have been going then and tapping into the Ponzi scheme and stealing money from another investor. Now, he did have a very specific way that he was stealing the money as well, because the funds were held in what was called an investment wrap platform. So it was an online ledger that financial advisors could use. And actually, you know, he was sending out statements that he was, you know, forging. But the whole idea of it was that your financial advisor could get a view of all of your different investments. You weren't just solely investing one, it was spread across a portfolio, and you could then see that portfolio. But what he had managed to do is realize that he could just use that system as a ledger. And if he ticked one little box that said external, he could have his own fictitious portfolio added to it. And that's what he was doing to keep track of it all.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Wow. And so how did he get caught in the end? Was it just the paperwork trail?
Yes. So it was very much that he kept everything in his, he was the sole director of his business, sole access to the bank accounts. Even though he had companies with staff, he was the only one that was able to do it. And I think towards the end, there was an accountant that somehow clicked over that this wasn't right, this wasn't marrying up. And that's when the Serious Fraud Office went in and did some digging, and boom, it all.
And was that accountant somebody that worked like with him or for him, or was it just like an independent?
I think it was do you know what? I haven't got to that point in the case yet, but I'm pretty sure it was an independent accountant. I'm going to be looking into that.
Sure.
Soon.
So can I just quickly tell you what I think are the bits that kind of really stand out to me in this case before we get into the questions? I haven't actually, I knew the broad bits and pieces, but I didn't know any kind of level of this detail. So thank you for explaining that. That's because I wanted to give you authentic answers and not because I was too lazy to do any research.
You tell yourself that.
I'm telling my viewers that. I never lie, you know that. The first thing that really strikes me compared to other fraud that I've either sort of read about or dealt with myself personally is just the level of patience. So he really was extremely cunning and conniving, right? He waited 40 years. Like most people would just not, most people, regardless of whether they're con artists or not, would not have the delayed gratification to wait that long. They would just want their riches much sooner. Even you know, delaying it for a couple of years is quite a big sort of cognitive load to take on all this guilt for such a long period of time. But he could do it for decades. So that is extremely unusual. And I suppose the other thing, which is exactly what you pointed out yourself, just the absolute lack of empathy. So most con artists will have some degree of distance from their victim. And even like victims like your sister who were in a romantic relationship with somebody they ripped off. I mean, that's still pretty heartless, but that's different from knowing a family for decades, knowing somebody romantically for years, and to sit there in a dying room and to have a child with fragile X that you're spending time with, knowing that you're basically screwing over their future. I mean, that's just like a next level lack of compassion and empathy. And I suppose the other thing that surprises me is I wonder what his exit plan was, because surely it must have been quite hard to get away with it, right? Like without him having to uproot his entire life, because he's literally living with and growing up with, and his family is growing up with his victims in a small community.
That's right. And it is a small community. So it's a town of like 150,000 people. And, you think 81 victims, what are the ripple effects out from that? The number's huge. And that's the only ones that came forward. I'm sure people didn't come forward because there's so much shame around being conned, isn't there, really? Yeah. His exit plan, good question. So in court, that obviously was asked to him, and also in restorative justice. I don't know, do you have restorative justice here, or is that just a New Zealand system?
I think that we do, but I think it is voluntary. So some perpetrators choose to do that, usually in kind of violent offences, either because of their own guilt or to help with leniency for their sentence.
Which, bingo, I think that's why he did it. I'm guessing, but I think there's definitely that idea that if you are willing to go into restorative justice, that you'll get some kind of leniency in the sentencing. So he did 15 sessions with of restorative justice, and across that time, so many of the victims obviously asked, what was your end game? And his answer was that he actually had a plan that he stated, and his plan was that he was going to pay it back. And his plan was that over the last couple of years, he'd got employees in that were actually better than him. So by the end of this year, he would then be able to have $2 million, and he was going to start paying back the oldest first, and then the sick. And then so he had an actual scaled system that he said he was going to do. And even in those restorative justice meetings, he said he still planned on paying it back. And I wanted to know from you, in your experience of con artists, would you, when they say something along those lines, is that coming from delusion, or is it just that they are so pathologically lying?
I think it depends on the individual's case. So you have to kind of examine the entire behavior. So somebody who is pathologically lying will have no clear, even though they might describe like some sort of exit plan, they won't have put into place any actual methods of carrying it out. Somebody who's delusional usually actually both of them will lack empathy or lack remorse, but somebody who is delusional just won't be able to kind of logically explain what their situation is. Does that make sense? So they're two slightly different cognitive processes. But I think the majority of people would be majority of people that commit fraud, especially sophisticated fraud like this, are not mentally ill. So most of them are doing it out of greed. It's only a very small proportion who would have a sort of mental illness, because mental illnesses, generally, they're quite blunt tools. So if somebody's like, delusional, hearing voices, psychotic, then usually their functioning decreases as well. So it's usually relatively obvious to pick up, and they struggle with complicated cognitive tasks. So if you think about the person I was talking about specifically in my book, I was really skeptical for many reasons. And one of those reasons was that she was claiming that she was really depressed and mentally unwell, but her level of functioning was actually very sophisticated.
The other thing that you bring up in your book, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, was that distinction of mad or bad. Because I'm an empathetic person naturally. So I always kind of look at a case and think, well, maybe there's, they're all mad. Maybe they're all mad. But where does that line get drawn? How do you make that distinction between mad or bad acts?
So that is a good question. It's a complicated question because it kind of depends on the context. So if you're talking about like a medical legal context or somebody that's done something in the criminal court, when you look at mad, there's different ways of defining it. If you define it as somebody that just does something that's completely incomprehensible to you, like kills a family member or, sexually assaults a child, then you could say that almost anybody that does that is mad because you can't understand how you do that. So that would be the layman's kind of interpretation. The psychiatrist's interpretation would be about a specific diagnosis. So if somebody's got something like a delusional disorder or schizophrenia, and you can prove that they've got a very fixed delusional belief. So hypothetically speaking, if somebody believed that they were a multimillionaire, so that's a relatively common grandiose delusions, but somehow are still able to have the cognitive sort of ability to commit fraud. And it's possible, it's unlikely, but it's possible. And if you can prove that, you can't just take their comments at face value. You have to, look through the medical notes, see that this was a consistent thing that they've reported throughout previous hospital admissions. That would be the way of defining it from a psychiatrist's point of view. But perhaps the most important definition would be a legal perspective. So that's when we're talking about the insanity defense. So your viewers have probably, or your listeners have probably heard of not guilty by reason of insanity. And that threshold is very high. So it's only actually found in a very small proportion of cases. So even if you're unwell, even if you're psychotic, that doesn't mean that you necessarily reach the threshold. And to reach that threshold, you either didn't know what you were doing or you didn't know that it was wrong. So again, right, to use the sort of the hypothetical situation, either you literally, and again, it's on the defense to prove this, you literally thought that you had so much money that you could replace it easily. So you didn't think that you were ripping people off money. Or that you had nihilistic delusions and you didn't believe that the very concept of money exists. So therefore you couldn't be ripping somebody off. But obviously you'd have to be pretty unwell to have those kind of thought processes. So those are the kind of people that would be in and out of hospital, psychiatric hospital, and would be extremely unwell. They're not kind of sophisticated fraudsters that you tend to see.
So in your experience, you've never really come across a con artist, or you wouldn't expect to find a con artist, fraudster sitting in that mad column?
Yeah, exactly right. I think I've seen it once in my career. And I think that was a complete, it was a very low level fraud. It was it's identity fraud. I think she'd used like some fake identity to get a passport illegally. This was a lady in South London who was like in her mid-40s. It's quite a while ago. And completely separate to that, she actually had schizophrenia, but she committed her offences, I think, with the aids of other shady people in the criminal underworld who she was related to. I think she actually did very little. She just gave documents and got this fake passport. But she became psychotic. And when I saw her, she was just so unwell. She was like screaming, shouting. She'd not eaten for days. She had children taken away from her. She had like feces spread across her own house. Like the whole place was absolutely trashed. She'd been hoarding for months. Hadn't put out rubbish. So I'm not suggesting that everybody who's mentally ill is like that. But what I'm saying is, for somebody to be so unwell that they couldn't even plead, or they would have an insanity defense, we're talking about people who are extremely unwell, not people who are functioning.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it sounds more like that the fraud was just a byproduct of all the rest of the stuff going on.
The fraud was a coincidence to her mental illness. But from every other case that I've seen of fraud from my professional career, I've never seen a case. I've seen some people trying to convince the court that they were unwell, like the woman I've talked about in my book, but I've never actually seen a credible case.
So what behaviors, I mean, we talk about they're obviously in the bad column. Is there a broad kind of, paint with a broad brush, but particular traits or behaviors that you would expect to see in somebody who commits fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the most obvious one, you don't have to be a psychiatrist to call this one out, is greed. So people people who are career fraudsters don't just have an ordinary level of greed of wanting, nice things to project a certain image. They go beyond that, where they're almost never satisfied with whatever kind of financial gain they get. And I think in terms of their actual behaviors, I think it's all about grooming. And what surprises me about Barry Kloogh is how effective he was at grooming. So grooming, as you'll know, is where if you come up to somebody, especially somebody you don't know, even somebody you do know, and you say, I've got this money, I've got this scheme that's going to make you it's going to give you a great return and you're going to get thousands of pounds, then unless somebody's very gullible, no one's going to believe you. So the way that people work is they gain small bits of confidence over increments over a long period of time. Usually months. Is very unusual for it to be decades like this man. But because it's like the slowly boiling frog. You know, the frog doesn't know he's being boiled because the temperature's rising so gradually they don't even notice. So I think that's what happens. So have you seen the Tinder Swindler?
Of course I have.
Yeah.
Of course I have.
That's the first thing that came to my mind when you were talking about your sister. So that's an absolute perfect example of somebody who's really adept at grooming. So I'm sure this guy Barry was as well, but he didn't, you know, he created this image before the Tinder Swindler is. He created this image before he got into any money troubles that was so bulletproof because he'd exposed these women to his lifestyle several times. So over time, they had no reason to doubt him. So I think that's one of the biggest. You have to be. What I'm saying is to be a good, effective fraudster, unless you get lucky by picking on vulnerable, you know, old men and women, to get the average mark, you have to actually be very charming, and you have to be able to groom people.
And I think that's a misconception, isn't it? That you can't be conned. I often hear when I tell people about either of those two stories, my sisters or my parents-in-law, well, I wouldn't do that. But they do. I think what people don't understand, and this is the reason that I ended up doing the Conning the Cod podcast, because I couldn't understand how my intelligent sister had fallen into the grips of it. And it is that missing piece of the puzzle, the grooming, isn't it? That makes you, that's the recipe almost.
And also, absolutely, no, I completely agree with you. I think the other thing is that, I mean, we're talking about, you know, financial fraud. I think most people have some sort of weakness or something that they're very passionate about. So if you can promise that person, if you're crafty enough to find out what that thing is, and you can find somebody that'll be willing to almost freeze reality to believe what they want to believe, right? So if somebody, not just money's the most obvious one, but if somebody wants fame, I think that would be another good example. Everything from, you know, casting agents to PR companies. I've even fallen short of this myself, actually. I've been, you know, years ago when I was trying to break into the world of media, I've had PR companies that promised me the world, and you believe them because, first of all, why wouldn't you? And secondly, because it's exactly what you want to hear and what you've been looking for months. So when the opportunity finally shows itself, then you're primed to be conned, I think. And it's different things for different people, I think. And you know, love is another one, I suppose. So if somebody's, you know, the Tinder Swindler is a perfect example of this. I think somebody who's struggled with relationships, really looking for that perfect man or woman, and then they appear.
And I think the irony is, I don't know if you read this article on the Tinder Swindler, but he actually ended up being conned recently himself because he wanted fame, and he paid someone so that he would get the blue tick on Twitter, and it was a complete con. He parted like $10,000. That's the best karma. But yeah, so I want to ask you about those traits. How would they, you know, what sort of things would you see those personality traits expressed like? How would they be expressed by a con man?
Before I answer that, there's a couple of things that I haven't got around to saying yet because they slipped my mind. The other thing is I kind of touched on it before, but narcissism is, and that's not quite the same as greed, but I think a lot of the people, and possibly this Barry Kloogh, they project this image. I think we all project images of ourselves, but there's something about them where they feel that they need to keep up this image that they've kind of cultivated. So I guess what I'm saying is, more than the average person, they need to be the cool guy with the cool car that, you know, has this kind of lifestyle. I think a lot of people, you know, fantasize about those kind of things, but we have these ethical boundaries. You know, the average person wouldn't kill or steal to get those things or con, whereas I think con artists have a deep sense of narcissism, and all narcissism comes from insecurity, which suggests that possibly at some point something happened to make them feel insecure, whether that was, you know, parents who didn't give them love or support, or whether it's them being bullied or sidelined at work, or, you know, they enter a job where they feel that their tasks or their role is inferior to their intelligence or education. It's different for different people, but usually there's something that causes an inferiority complex, and that causes narcissism.
And can you give a little description of what narcissism actually is in its day-to-day form?
Sure. So the narcissism is like a noun. Is that a noun? Yeah. Narcissism as a noun is when people basically, it's about being the center of attention and only wanting other people to love you. So narcissistic people, including people with narcissistic personality disorder, which is actually a psychiatric diagnosis, they only care about themselves. So they're the kind of people that I'm sure we've all met people like this who will constantly talk about themselves, never ask you a question about yourself, sort of indifferent to other people, even people that they're potentially in relationships with, or even family members. They love praise. They kind of set up situations where they're the center of attention. If they don't get, they constantly question either directly or indirectly their worth to other people. So if there's any situation, the kind of questions they would ask or the kind of conversations they would start would be, how did I look, or how did I come across in that, rather than, how are the other people feeling? And they take criticism really badly. So they either completely dismiss it, as in this person doesn't know what they're talking about, or they become abnormally upset and they focus way too much on criticism than is healthy.
That's interesting. Now, I haven't actually struck upon anyone who's mentioned or criticized Barry, so I don't know about that, but obviously it all rings true. The flashy cars, the holidays, everything was about the big I am, essentially, with him. So that would that could fit. Is there any specific different things that they have? Like, I've heard of things like predatory memory, or like an empathy switch that might be something that would fit within the con artist's makeup.
Yeah, I mean, I think all con artists have a lack of empathy, but I think some people, like this guy Barry Kloogh, and like potentially your sister's perpetrator, must have like an extra layer of decreased ability to feel empathy if they commit these cons to people that they actually know personally. I suppose the other thing is denial to a degree. It's quite a complicated one, because I think they know, when I say denial, they know what they're doing is wrong. That's unquestionable. But I think possibly, especially in a Ponzi scheme, they might believe that they can somehow make it back miraculously, even though that doesn't make sense to us. So like a gambler would be a perfect example of this. Somebody who, despite the fact that they've lost money over and over again, they're convinced they just need to make one or a couple of good bets and they'll win it all back. So I think some con artists just don't care, and they just want to run off with the money. But I think some, especially people like this guy, especially if they're in a Ponzi scheme, probably to a degree, even though deep down they know it's not going to happen, part of them lives with this hope that somehow they'll turn it around and be able to get everyone's money back.
Yeah, and I think that that was articulated quite a few times through the court. He did say things like, I took a wrong turn at one stage and just didn't go back on the right path. So whether or not it was premeditated, it's hard to know. Is there any way that you can tell whether some crimes like that are premeditated? Is there clues?
I think this is going a bit left field here. I think that these kind of crimes, so when I say these, I mean types of frauds that have been committed repeatedly over a long period of time, are neither premeditated or impulsive. I think they're somewhere in between, which is you either by creation or accident get away with a small tiny bit of fraud, and then it doesn't come back to you, you don't get caught, and then you think, well, that was only a little bit, that was only $10, and then you might do it again and again, and then you increase it a little bit, and then you do it again and again and again, and I think it snowballs. Over time you become more confident in yourself because nobody's picking you up on this, and in the case of someone like Barry Kloogh, the auditors are missing it, other people that I'm working with are missing it, people seem to trust me. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think it's like an evil sort of rubbing your hands decision that I'm going to rip all these people off one day. I think it's a gradual, it's almost like they're grooming themselves. It's a gradual increase of, well, I got away with this, well, that person doesn't really seem to mind. And I think they quash, I'm not in any way trying to decrease their responsibility, but I think they don't have the same obvious flood of guilt that you or I might expect. I think that over time they get away with it more and more and more, and they stop thinking about the consequences, or well, it's not they stop thinking about it, but they care a bit less over time about the consequences, and they excuse their own guilt over time, I think.
Like an incremental criminal, just
exactly. Yeah.
Little steps, and then they turn up down that path.
Because the thing is, right, if you think about it, if you were in Barry's shoes and if you got away with it for decades, literally decades, then there's no reason to worry, really, is there?
No, and I think that's it. Like, he seemed to have moments when, so obviously a Ponzi scheme needs to be fed because people are taking money out of that Ponzi scheme as well as putting money in. And the ways that he would get that money, he never seemed, there's the odd time where you hear from clients where he sounded like he was, panicking and the house of cards might have been coming down on him, but he still every time did manage to get away with it, and he'd come up with new ways to get the money. So he would, one of the ways that I thought was quite interesting is to get the money out of the investments, if they were legitimately invested, which sometimes they were, oftentimes he'd legitimately invested this money into the platform.
Yeah.
What he would do is like, oh, I need to feed the Ponzi scheme. So he would go and cash out that investment. But the only way that he could cash that out as a financial advisor was the money would go directly back into the client's account. So whoever owned that would get these big chunks of money back that they hadn't asked for. Up comes Barry Kloogh, ring, ring, ring. Oh, sorry, my fat fingers have pushed the wrong button. And can you please just put that money, sorry, back into this account? He would then give them a different account number, which was his own personal bank account for the business. And that's why he would like launder the money through. So he kept, he was smart in the way that he did it.
Yeah.
And bold.
Yeah, absolutely.
Surprising.
Interesting case.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me have a look at some of these questions I've got. I mean, why do you think it is that we as humans are susceptible to being conned? Because it's so much about trust, isn't it?
Yeah. So I think it was a bit like what I was talking about before. I think most people have something that they believe is missing in their life. Yeah. And some people it's as simple as, money. And that's understandable. People want a more comfortable life, especially if for example, you're in a job that you don't particularly enjoy and you've been doing it for months, years, and you don't feel like you're getting the return that you deserve. So basically all YouTubers, then you can understand why.
Or podcasters.
Or podcasters. You can understand why if a kind of easy option presents itself, if you've trained your mind to look for that thing, then I think not everybody, but a lot of people are primed to be conned. I think that's part of the reason. But I suppose in this specific case of Barry, you just wouldn't suspect it. I wouldn't suspect it. I think if I had I do actually have a financial advisor, and this conversation is scaring me. But if I had
it should.
If I had a scheme that I had with somebody for 15 years and it seemed to be fine, and then I probably would go with them to invest the money, really, because it's easier to go with somebody that you know and have no suspicions of than having to go through the whole process of finding somebody else. So I actually think it's scarily difficult to pick out somebody like this particular man.
Yeah, and I think that was going to be my next question. Is there is a lot of shame that you should have spotted it, you should have reacted or seen some red flags.
Yeah.
But in your experience, how easy is that to spot?
I think there are red flags when it comes to fraud, but I think they are fallible, and I think in this case possibly Barry has managed to somehow sidestep all of them. So things like, again, talking about financial advisors, things like reviews. So you've got to be suspicious if you look on a really pretty cleverly designed website, but there's not really any client reviews, or there's quotes from people that can't be kind of checked. So no reviews, no evidence of testimonials, credible testimonials from previous clients. If there's no real substance to what they're saying. So I think if they talk really vaguely about terms, as opposed to, this is your portfolio and these are the figures and this is what we'd invest in, that's what you want to see. You want to see some detail, even though when my financial advisor talks to me, I don't understand any of it. At least sometimes he's saying something versus somebody that has these kind of, vague, random statements. And I think basically a traceable history is always a sign of a good investment. And also somebody who, connected to that, if they have if there's a lot of moving around or a lot of vagueness or uncertainty, not just in their statements, but in their actual history, then that would be another flag. And I suppose finally, if somebody's a bit too keen, you've got to wonder why. So if you've got somebody who's a financial advisor who claims to be able to give you an amazing return on your money, you've got to ask why hasn't a lot of other people signed up, and why is this person so keen to sign me up? Because surely if I'm getting 10% return within a year, then surely everybody would be up for it. So why are they so get my business? Having said all of that, I don't think Barry actually used any of those tactics. So I think
No.
he's almost infallible. I don't see how anybody realistically could have known without the benefit of hindsight, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where there needs to be governing bodies that are overseeing that. I mean, what is an authorized financial advisor comes into to play there. Yeah. Now, one thing I didn't mention is in the judge's sentencing notes, there was a psychologist that had assessed him, and one of the what the psychologist says is he refers to Barry having a cognitive disorder or dissonance.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So cognitive dissonance is like a psychiatric phenomenon, or psychological phenomenon, I should say, where somebody has two separate thoughts that are opposing, and it causes them like distress inside. So to be specific for Barry, maybe one of his thoughts was, I'm a good person, I'm part of this community, and people like me. So that would be one aspect of his image that he has. But obviously deep down, he knows that he is ripping people off. So even though he might have a degree of denial, and I think he probably did, and even though he might have tried to convince himself that he's going to get at least some of the money back, which is what he said during the restorative justice, I'm sure to a degree he must have known that he was ripping people off. So there's two kind of opposing thoughts. So that causes psychological distress, and people react with it in different ways. Some people go and confess and change their ways. Some people become really bitter and twisted, or some people, just displace it in some other way. So that's what cognitive dissonance is. It's when you have two internal things that are struggling against each other. Sexuality was a big thing, not so much nowadays, but decades ago when it was less acceptable, that would be another big kind of area of cognitive dissonance, where a man or woman might think they're gay, but no, it's socially unacceptable. So they try and kind of hide it or displace it. So it's just it causes this internal kind of struggle.
And is that something that you would see with con artists? Is that like a normal trait, or is that just something perhaps more specific to this case?
I think most con artists are just greedy, just want to do something relatively quick, take the money and dash, and have very little remorse or empathy. Most would fit into that category. I think there would be some, especially if they're closely connected to their victim, whether that's a romantic relationship or whether, like in this case, they've known them in the community. I think there probably is a degree of cognitive dissonance. But I suppose it was like what we were talking about before, over time, when you can kind of chip away at your own guilt or reduce your own guilt because it's lasted for such a long period of time. I think the same thing happens with cognitive dissonance to a degree.
So we touched on it earlier before, but those emotions that con artists display, I just want to delve in a little bit deeper onto those, and ask you, like, starting with empathy. If you saw, for example, Barry Kloogh empathizing with a person that is dying, how, in your mind or in your experience, more likely, would you believe that empathy to be actually genuine?
I think if you saw it, so if we were witnessing him at that moment next to a dying sort of friend who had esophageal cancer, I think it would come across as very real. I think that even the best psychiatrist in the world, which I'm not, would not be able to really be able to differentiate that, because it's all sort of internal. In fact, you could even go further to say that, and again, I'm not trying to excuse any of his actions, but some people, especially people who are good at conning other people, can con themselves to a degree, so they're able to compartmentalize their guilt from their compassion. So I guess what I'm trying to say in a long-winded way is he might have had a degree of empathy at the time for his friend dying, even though deep down he knew he was going to rip his wife off. He just was able to split that more than you or I or a normal person could do. I mean, the other thing that I haven't really said about Barry's, and I'm loath to overuse this phrase because it gets used overused so much, especially by psychiatrists such as myself, is psychopath. So, as you probably know, for those of your listeners and my viewers who don't, a psychopath is not necessarily associated with violence. It's somebody who lacks empathy, doesn't learn from their mistakes, acts impulsively, acts aggressively, doesn't care about the rights of others, doesn't care about the law. So it's all those things, but they're also quite charming and manipulative. So I think there's a strong case that Barry might be all of those things, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think that did come up in court. A few people threw that word around.
Okay.
What about remorse?
I mean, the problem with the remorse, a bit like empathy, is it's quite easy to fake, isn't it? So I guess the way to really analyze that is remorse through behavior rather than through words. So if he's saying that he's really sorry and he's apologizing to all these people when they see him in prison as part of restorative justice, that doesn't mean anything because anyone can say that. But you know, if he has in any way tried to make amends, I'm not sure how he would, because I imagine all his assets would be seized. But if he did in any way, then I suppose you could argue that he might have a level of remorse. But I'd be surprised if that happened, to be honest.
Yeah. And I think even the judge in the case in the sentencing notes said the way that he apologized and showed remorse was actually really patronizing and almost re-victimizing of the victims. He'd say things along the lines of, you couldn't have done anything. There was nothing that you could have done. And yeah, he's a piece of shit, but that's by the by.
I mean, I think you could argue that he can't really have remorse, can he? Because it's not something he did in a sort of impulsive flash of rage or anger. It's not like, you know, other patients that I see might get into fights when they're having an argument or get drunk and do something that they clearly regret. But this is somebody who's carried out calculated activities for decades. So I'm not sure if it's even possible that he could have any level of remorse. I mean, obviously he's sad that he got caught. I don't doubt that. But whether he actually really cares about the victims, I don't know if that's possible.
Yeah. And I do wonder that as well. It's almost another re-victimization of them, because when he's saying to when he's in these the restorative justice meetings, he's actually saying, I will pay you back. I'm going to pay you back. Don't worry, I'll pay you back. With knowing that he's facing down a sentence, and don't forget, he's 57 when he's being caught, so he's got an 8-year, I think, sentence on top of that. When he comes out, he's not going to be able to pay back $15 million. I mean, if he can, amazing, but that's just not. It's not a realistic kind of thing to say, and it's almost hurtful to say it back to them. And I don't think he's got any remorse personally, but I don't know these things. That's your job. So one of the things that I remember you telling me last time we met at CrimeCon was that oftentimes when you're interviewed, people don't ask you the right questions. So I want to ask you this. What questions have I missed that you think I should have asked that were relevant to this case?
I honestly don't think there are any, because I've shoehorned everything that I wanted to say into my answers.
Yay!
So you've got.
Well, that's good.
You've got 100% marks there.
I got my pound of flesh.
As we before we finish, should we talk about our activities and social media, etc.?
Sure.
You want to go first?
Sure.
Tell my YouTube viewers where we can find you and what you're working on.
Okay, so you can find me at various places. I've got 3 podcasts: Conning the Con, Stop the Killing, and Guilty Greenie. And if you just want to go to one spot, go to @Community Podcast on Instagram. That's con with an N. See what I did there? And yeah, that's probably the best place to find me.
I'll make sure my social media guy puts all those links up in the descriptions. So my kind of main media platform and goal is my YouTube channel, A Psych for Sore Minds, where I cover lots of different areas related to true crime and mental illness. So sometimes I take high profile cases and I dissect them with my own psychoanalysis, a bit like what our discussion has been about. Sometimes I look at individual kind of offending, so like the psychology behind domestic violence or the psychology behind stalking or something like that. And sometimes I do collaborations and interviews like we're just doing today. So A Psych for Sore Minds. Oh, and I do have a book which came out a couple of weeks ago called In Two Minds.
Highly recommend. Halfway through, addicted. Do you know what? Normally I listen to my books on Audible because I'm lazy, but also because you can be hands-free doing stuff. And I got into this habit of putting books in and then falling asleep and waking up and not knowing what the hell was going on. I can't do that with your book. I have to take it on a dog walk or something that I'm concentrating on because it's so engaging. And one night I was like waking up at like 1 o'clock, I put the book in, listen to it. And then I was like, I'm not getting sleepier. I'm getting more awake. So, which is a great sign, isn't it, for a book? Very engaging.
That is very kind of you to say. Tell us about your CrimeCon shenanigans that are coming up this year.
So I'm going to be flying the coop and going to Las Vegas for CrimeCon US, and I think that's on April 29th to the 1st of May this year. And I'll be there on Podcast Row, and my co-host on Stop the Killing will also be there as a speaker. So there's going to be loads of opportunities to bump into me and her. And of course, you and I will be at CrimeCon in June for London. What are the dates? I can't even remember.
Just about to ask you. I think maybe actually, just bear with
11th and 12th of June.
Okay, I believe you. You sound confident in that.
I think it is.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it's 11th and 12th. All right, cool. Sarah, absolute pleasure having you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I will stay in touch and see you in June.